My name is Ashley Dawson. I'm a professor of English at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and the College of Staten Island. And I'm also a long-term time climate justice activist. I have written a number of books relating to climate activism, including Extreme Cities and Extinction, A Radical History. And I have a forthcoming book, which is entitled People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons.
Hi, my name is Alok Amatya. I'm a faculty member at Georgia Tech School of Literature, Media, and Communication. My current book in progress is titled Resource Conflict Literature, Reading Indigenous Struggles. Today we're embarking on a short discussion on the topic of extraction in the contemporary age. We're creating this video as an accompaniment to our special issue on the topic of literature and extraction in the spring 2020 issue of Modern Fiction Studies. This discussion will be the first in a series of videos created by authors who contributed to our special issue on literature and extraction. And today we'll also be talking briefly about Ashley's new book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons.
Great. Well, Alok, it's so great to be in conversation with you. I'm really looking forward to talking about the special issue and our introduction. But of course, since the special issue came out, the world has been turned topsy-turvy by the pandemic and the economic crash that's related to it, which has also impacted extraction around the globe. So I thought one good way to begin would be to talk a little bit about the pandemic and extraction. So maybe you could begin with a few comments about how you see the COVID-19 pandemic shaping the landscape of material extraction around the globe and the way in which it's all refracted through cultural lens.
Thanks for that question, Ashley. As I see it, there's a real threat today of the extractive agenda being fast-forwarded in important countries like India and Brazil, and a particular risk still of the fast-forwarding of extractive industries being done under the guise of passing on the benefits to the people at a time of economic downturn. Whereas these days, if you look at industries like mining or the construction of big oil pipelines, there are not really a lot of laborers being involved. A lot of these industries rely on machines and trucks to get their work done. One particular issue I want to highlight is the new proposal of a law called EIA Notification 2020 being put forward in India. This is an amendment to the existing environmental impact assessment laws being put forward by the Ministry of Environment in India, and being proposed in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of March. What the law proposes is to dilute the existing regulations for extractive industries like mining, the construction of dams, and so on. And it includes provisions like the exclusion of certain industries marked as strategic from public scrutiny completely. The other, confounding thing proposed by the new draft is the granting of retroactive approvals to certain industries. So essentially, big mining companies like the Aditya Birla Aluminum Group or ArcelorMittal, they could break laws when it comes to deforestation or polluting nearby rivers, and their activity could be approved retroactively rather than being fined or rather than further restrictions being imposed. So I think the way in which the pandemic sort of creates a situation where the people who usually work against, who work in resistance against these sorts of removal of regulation when it comes to the environment, and people who lead indigenous struggles are so busy suffering, so busy dealing with the after of the pandemic, this creates a situation where the government is able to steamroll laws of this kind rather than moving ahead in a more considered fashion.
I'd love to talk more about how resistance forces on the ground are reacting to the situation that you are sketching in, which, maybe could be called disaster extraction, riffing on Naomi uh, uh, Klein's ideas of disaster capitalism or coronavirus capitalism, because I think we can
Right.
really think about that in relation to extractivist industries. But I think that the kind of big picture, which it might be useful to sketch in, is the fact that the coronavirus pandemic has caused a massive crash in many extractive industries around the world, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the fossil capitalist sector. And the reasons for that are fairly obvious, with really significant numbers of people around the world being confined in their homes in states of lockdown of one kind or another. There's been a sudden kind of clamp on consumption of all sorts of raw materials that are part of the global economy, and particularly of fossil fuels. And so we've seen the price of oil crashing and bottoming out. And this isn't just about the coronavirus. Of course, there was a fateful decision taken by Russia and Saudi Arabia about the same time that the pandemic was hitting Europe and beginning to play out in the United States, to engage in a kind of price war around oil, with much speculation coming about how the price war had to do with a desire to cripple or perhaps even destroy the fracking industry in the United States, which had never abided by any of the production guidelines which OPEC had mandated when there have been previous crashes in the price of oil. So we've really seen prices for fossil fuels bottom out, and kind of crises in global supply lines in general, right? So people have been talking about this pandemic as the first kind of global infrastructural supply chain crisis, one presumably of many to come as climate change impacts more strongly. And as this crisis has caused a collapse in fossil fuel industries, activists in the United States, at least, have been arguing for it as an opportunity to put in place a whole series of energy transition initiatives. And actually, it hasn't just been activists in the United States. Even the head of the International Energy Agency has been saying this is a kind of rare window of opportunity to make a much more accelerated shift to renewable energy. So I wonder to what extent you see that as an argument that is being made in parts of the global south, where you seem to be saying that governments have been using a kind of economic crisis related to the pandemic to write off all sorts of forms of regulation, which has also been playing out in a place like the United States with the Trump regime, of course, trying to accelerate environmental exploitation as much as possible. So, what has been the kind of pushback and the kind of arguments that you've seen folks who are resisting extraction using in the present context, and how successful have those arguments been, I wonder?
I think that's a great point, Ashley. Cities, major cities in the global south, whether it's New Delhi or Kathmandu, Nepal, or Dhaka, have all seen a radical improvement in the quality of the air and the water in the rivers. So certainly, there's a degree of a celebration of those facts. But I think if we were to think about how we got here in the first place, uh, you know, I think one of the threat posed to us by the collusion between large extractive industries and the government at the federal and state levels that we see in major paradigmatic nations like India is sort of one of the main reasons that's still standing in the way of change in the future. Um, and from that, as a result of that, what we see is big mining companies in Chhattisgarh, India, for instance, paying a really low percentage of their revenue to the state government, and which is further not really accountable for passing the benefits on to the people. Um, and even if you talk about the state of Oklahoma, right, in the US, fracking companies there are paying anywhere from between 2 to 7% of their revenues to the state at a time when the education sector, to a lot of other services provided by the state really need that money. So I think when we get to the root of the issue, um, that's something we need to address in order to bring in lasting change. Um, and I wonder, yeah, I wonder what comments you would have on the possibilities and the dilemmas that are brought forth by the pandemic when it relates to extraction.
Yeah, well, I think that the dilemmas we face in the present are very much linked to much more long-standing crises.
Mm,
With the economy crashing, it's very easy for kind of right-wing, populist, pro-extractivist demagogues like we have in
mm,
the United States or in India or in so many countries
mm,
around the world, come to power over the last decade to make arguments in favor of growth, right? We
mm,
need to
mm,
get the economy, the national economy, and the engine that drives it going again. And how do we do that? Well, we augment extraction either
mm,
through intensifying domestic industry or creating contracts with foreign powers to come in and
mm,
take out more oil or gas or metals of various different kinds, et cetera, right? So
mm, mm,
the and so I think the present moment kind of intensifies dynamics which had been playing out over the last couple of decades, right? When we had this really remarkable growth of the global economy after the crisis of 2008, largely spurred by China and its
mm,
massive efforts to overcome the economic downturn through a
mm,
kind of huge Keynesian welfare sort of state stimulus program that meant there
mm,
were huge increases in natural resource extractivist patterns around the globe. And many
mm.
leftist governments went along with that, right? So, you have
Huh.
leaders in pink tide nations like Bolivia and
Mm,
Ecuador signing contracts with China and big oil companies based in Europe and the
mm,
US to extract oil in order to benefit the nation and put in place development programs. And, these programs were much contested, particularly by
mm,
indigenous
mm,
peoples whose lands were going to be impacted and who had articulated a kind of ethos of caring for the land under ideas of buen vivir or, a
mm,
kind of good life that had often been codified into national constitutions. In
mm,
Ecuador, Earth got official legal entitlement and
mm.
recognition, and
Right.
yet the governments continued to extract oil and precious minerals and metals and other things, right? So these massive contradictions were in place even before the crisis played out. I think that the
Mm,
right wing was able to take advantage of that, as the
mm,
economy began to cool a little bit over the last couple of years. They
mhm,
essentially fought back against the left-wing governments in parts of the world and said, we're going to do extraction better. We're just going to get rid of all the regulations,
I
and
see.
this
Mm,
is really going to benefit people.
mm,
And I think that the pandemic threatens to just intensify those kinds of dynamics. So it's going to
mm,
take a really strong kind of set of arguments about green stimulus and the need for an alternative path.
mm,
And a kind of challenge to ideologies of development to make that happen, and
mm,
to fend off the appeal of ideas of development, I think.
mm,
How does that resonate with your sense? Particularly, I want to kind of shift a little bit and ask about, extraction more broadly and how we can think about extraction not just in relation to fossil fuels or, minerals such as copper and cobalt, but extraction of information, for example, from populations, extraction of DNA, extraction more broadly thought about. How's that been playing out in relation to the pandemic and then more broadly in recent decades?
Um, I think that's a great question, Ashley. And I'd really like what you said about the need to sort of build on the strengths that already exist in so many Latin American countries of indigenous communities and their struggles that have already been codified into certain laws. Um, I think the extraction of human labor, for instance, in South Asia, can be seen in the massive crisis, massive human rights crisis seen today in countries like India and Nepal due to the condition of migrant laborers there, with only 4 hours of notice being given to the people of India to essentially begin a shutdown um, for because of the coronavirus pandemic. Um, the face of human tragedy has been seen in the form of, uh, you know, all kinds of suffering faced by migrant laborers, from starvation to the lack of water to basic sanitation, and um, really inadequate help for the migrant laborers to get back to their home countries. This is certainly something we've seen in my home country of Nepal as well, where so many migrant laborers have been held at quarantine camps with not enough facilities by the government, and there's still not enough facilities for getting the migrant laborers home to their home communities or for providing any other kind of rehabilitation. And so, and if we begin to think about why there's such a huge migrant population traveling to other countries and to nearby cities right in the first place, I think we begin to get to the big issues of climate change that you've discussed so well um, in many of the books, including Extreme Cities, the previous one. And I really like one of the points you made, in which you suggest that, right, we can watch the films like The Day After Tomorrow, where the climate change is presented in the form of a massive apocalyptic threat. But such huge cultural vehicles still may not do an adequate job of getting across the nuances of climate change, and rather it is important to magnify the voices of communities that are at the front lines of climate change, whether these are coastal southwestern Bangladeshi communities where people are being displaced by sea level rise, or indigenous people in Papua New Guinea that are being displaced from their home communities by the arrival of huge companies to mine for nickel and other minerals. Um, so I think hopefully, with the expansion of the environmental humanities in the United States and in other countries around the world, um, there is a situation where the voices of people who are facing the consequences of climate change and the extractive industries can be highlighted well in the future through our teaching of literature and other disciplines. Um, when it comes to the investment being made in China, not just in the extraction of fossil fuel. And I wanted to turn a little bit towards your new book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons. What do you think about the investment being made in China right now in solar power? So even as countries in Europe and China, the major power in Asia, race to construct solar power farms and wind farms. Um, is is that the solution then to the crisis posed by our reliance on fossil fuels, or should we be a little bit wary of the motives of these huge economic powers in rapidly constructing these solar and wind farms?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Alok. A lot of people have written about what Naomi Klein calls blockadia. There's some great
Mm,
work out there. Jeremy Brecker, for instance, has a wonderful book on how to essentially shut down fossil capitalism through strategic interventions to block
mm,
pipelines and push for divestment campaigns in organizations on all sorts of levels. So there's been a lot of intellectual work around resistance strategies, and of course there's a huge amount of activist work going on the ground. I mean, here in
mm,
New York, for instance, we just successfully fought off an effort to build a new pipeline through the northern section of Brooklyn, which was going to
mm,
be
mm.
bringing fracked gas from the Marcellus Shale in western Pennsylvania, because
Huh.
even if fracking is illegal in New York State, we still get a massive amount of the natural
Mm,
gas, which drives our energy infrastructure from places where it's legal and where it's
right.
absolutely destroying people's lives and destroying the landscape. So,
Mm,
these battles, kind of blockadia battles, aren't just rural ones. They're ones that are going on all over the place. I mean,
mm.
sacrifice zones are ubiquitous now, and
Oh,
so the struggles and the possibilities for solidarity are absolutely paramount. So I think it's important to kind of keep focus on that. But in my book, People's Power, I wanted to think about renewable energy and
mm,
what it represents and how it could be built out in a little bit more detail, because I feel like
mm,
there's this kind of underlying sense that solar power is getting cheaper and cheaper. It's now cheaper than coal, for instance. And because of that dynamic, which is largely driven, as you just observed, by the massive development of solar panel production in China over the last couple of decades, there's this kind of idea that the free market is just going to kind of inherently get us to energy transition. But what I point out in my book is that that's just absolutely not the case. Empirically speaking, the world still has less than 10% modern renewables, such as solar and wind power, driving our energy infrastructures. And if
I
we
see.
also include the transportation sector or heating and cooling of buildings, it's an even smaller amount of energy that is actually driving our economies that's genuinely renewable.
Mm,
So
mm,
we have massive work to do to
mm,
shut down fossil capitalism and create an alternative.
mm,
So that's one point I want to make in my book. But I
mm,
also don't want I want us to be very canny about the transition we're
mm,
making, and not to see um, renewable energy as some panacea, because the very
mm,
issues of extraction that we've been talking about are still going to be around. I mean,
mm,
where does the steel and the minerals that go into um, wind turbines or solar panels, where does that material come from? I mean,
mm,
often it comes from the same global supply lines and networks of imperialist extraction that run the fossil capitalist economy.
mm, mm,
So this dictates a great deal of kind of critical thought and tracking of infrastructures, and a kind of activist mobilization around these kinds of
huh,
issues, right? And
mm,
coming back to some of the comments you made, I think we need to think about extraction in its broadest possible sense, and that
mm,
includes, debt and the long
right.
history of extracting debt from the global south, and under
Mm,
neoliberalism and structural adjustment, opening
mm,
economies up, getting them more disempowered and more prone to extract and export natural resources.
mm,
So we really need to think about that history and make sure that as we fight for a Green New Deal that's going to build
right.
out forms of renewable power and the kind of
Mm,
infrastructures that support them, we're not putting in place a new form of kind of green colonialism, or a
right.
kind of green capitalism light that is just
Mm,
a new round of imperial extraction. So I think that's a really key thing to think about and to track
mm,
as we fight against fossil capitalism.
mm. That makes great sense, Ashley. And as we think about how to sort of organize against the threat of a new green imperialism, I find the idea of the energy commons, the people's power, so compelling. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by the energy commons, and how do you arrive historically at this idea?
Yeah, well, I get the idea from a kind of opposition to the privatized infrastructures of fossil capitalism. In the United States, for example, whoever owns the land owns the resources underneath, and that means that you get big oil coming in, sending landmen to get people to sign away the rights to basically have all of their resources
Mm,
extracted out from under them, and often they don't understand that. And
mm,
you get a kind of brutal Malthusian, almost Hobbesian violence playing out in many places that's illustrated in films like There Will Be Blood. So instead of that kind of privatized mentality that we have inherited, what I want to argue is that we need to think of energy as a public good in the same
mm,
way that we tend to think of water, although water is also being privatized and commodified around the world, but it tends to more often be thought of as a public
mm,
good. Or, air or forms of culture. These are part
mm,
of the kind of global commons. And of course, there's a whole body of scholarship debating the commons, with Elinor
mm,
Ostrom being a particularly important writer. She's an economist who articulated ideas of community governance of the commons. And,
mm,
and that's why I think this idea of the commons is particularly important, because, I mean, I've mentioned the history of kind of privatization of natural resources that characterizes the US.
mm,
But I think it's also important to think about other traditions where oil and other resources under the ground have been seen as the property of the nation.
right.
And, accessing and controlling those resources has been a really key element of anti-imperialist struggles,
Mm,
going back to the nationalization of oil in Iran,
mm,
and the resulting overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 by the US
mm,
CIA,
mm,
and then all of the forms of imperial warfare and clandestine activities that followed over the last roughly half century or so. So there have been these kind of titanic struggles to control oil and turn it into a people's resource. But all too often, when these struggles have been successful, they haven't actually benefited the people in general, right? And this can be quite controversial, but you can look at examples like, I don't know, Nigeria or even Venezuela, right, where controlling the resources in the name of the nation has not actually benefited the majority of people on the ground. So the idea of the commons is something that I am using to talk about new, more democratic mechanisms for controlling the resources, and the need for those kinds of new democratic mechanisms as we push towards energy transition. And so,
mm,
for instance, I talk about the struggle in Berlin, uh,
mm,
part of Germany's quite famous Energiewende, or energy transition, to establish forms of municipal democracy that can control a energy generating facility that has been put in place by the city.
mm,
So, how do you have forms of direct democracy parallel to representative democracy
mm,
once you take energy out of the hands of some private corporation? Those are the
mm,
kinds of questions. And I think they raise bigger questions, which the left really needs to think through, about the
mm,
relationship between the state and social movements.
mm,
And these are questions which have been, playing out on the ground in recent decades, from Occupy to the Pink Tide, right, where there have been efforts
right.
to think about in places like Brazil under Lula and the Workers' Party, to think about having the left both be in power after electoral victories, but then also have social movement mobilizations putting pressure
Mm,
on the kind of elected governments to make them more responsive to popular demands. And so that's the idea, to think with the energy commons, and to use it to try and have a genuinely democratic form of governance of energy, these new energy infrastructures, which we're really fighting to establish in order to prevent climate chaos and cataclysm.
And I should say, folks, you can read about these topics and much more in Ashley's new book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons. We'll be sure to add links to Ashley's new book, as well to our special issue of MFS on lithium extraction in the bio below. So on that note, thank you for listening to our video and joining us.
Thanks so much, Alok. It's been great being in dialogue. And just to remind everyone that this is the first in a series of videos, and we'll have some of the other contributors to the special issue of Modern Fiction Studies who will also be posting their own videos to illustrate their essays. So be sure to check out the special issue and also come back for future videos in this series. Thank you so much.